Hello there, my name is Jeroen. Welcome to British Humour. I will try to give you a bit of a insight on British humour in the next 15 minutes. If you look at the bottom of the slide here, you see a line. It's a quote from Oscar Wilde. It says, "It is clear that humour is far superior to humour." Now, if you understand that line, then you know what the preference of Mr. Oscar Wilde was, and that there's a difference between American humour and English humour. So, going on to the next slide. What is typical British humour, you ask? Well, in this class I will try to explain to you what British humour is, and I will do so by covering 3 chapters. First, a piece of history where I will try to explain how the British got their humour and how they use it. Second, I go by 8 themes that are typical for British humour. Some of these themes might come across to you as not funny at all. Chances are, if you're not British or English, then most of them don't, but that's the main reason of explaining them to you. Then number 3, you have your British versus your American humour. Well, in this little chapter I will try to show you that humour is culturally determined, and even though they do speak the same language, they often don't understand each other. So, a tiny piece of history. First of all, the first rule of British humour is to mock the establishment. And they do so by using satire. Well, satire, there's always a little bit of truth in it, right? And what they do is they do it in a loving and reverent way. And you have to remember those 2 words because they are very important. They come back a few times this video. So, the British used to have a class system, right? They had the working class, the middle class and the upper class. Working class made fun of the middle class made fun of the working class. And they both made fun of the upper class. Well, this is rooted in 1,000 years of history. And the irony is that in and after the Victorian era, people in colonized countries, they regarded the whole of England as upper class. And so the British, well, they were mocked by all the people they ever oppressed. So who do the Britons make fun of then? Well, before we venture into this, who is mocked by who, we must first understand that humour is the default setting in British conversation. Unless they absolutely need to be serious or they're with unfamiliar people, they use humour. And often there is no intention of genuinely insulting people whatsoever. It's just their way of looking at life. So whenever you hear a Brit make a joke of someone else or at someone else's expense, you must understand that Britons make fun of themselves too. Better yet, they tend to ridicule themselves at every chance they get. They're masters at knowing their own flaws and ridicule them. So, but as all people do, British also like to make fun of people from other countries. Normally, people tend to ridicule the country that's next to them. You know, us Dutchies, we make fun of the Belgians and the Germans. Okay, well, everybody makes fun of the Germans. The Americans, they make fun of the Canadians, you know, and so on. So, the British, they didn't really have a country next to them, but since they have such a rich history in governing the world, they now make fun of everybody. So they make fun of the French for World War II and their funny accent, the Indians for their accent, obviously, Germany for their lack of sense of humour, and World War II, of course, America for their arrogance and lack of sophistication, because they're all hillbillies, and there's this rivalry between England and the other UK countries. So they mock the Irish and the Scottish, where the Scottish and the Irish, they mock the English. So, 8 themes. I told you about 8 themes, and I will venture into this right now. And I'll start off with the most important one of all. It's called irony. Irony is used all day, every day. You stand in front of your window, looking outside, it's raining cats and dogs, and you say, "Oh, lovely day, isn't it, dear?" Well, that's kind of irony. And you do this with number 2, a deadpan face. And a deadpan face is when you tell a joke, and no matter how ridiculous it is, you keep a straight face. For instance, a goalkeeper in an interview, he just lost 9-0, and in an interview after the match he states, "I just played the best match of my life." Or Cara Delevingne, she's depicted here in the slide. She was asked on American television once whether she had read John Green's book, Paper Towns, before she started in the movie, and she scoffed at him, and she said, "No, I never read the book or the script, I just winged it." So going on to numbers 3 and 4, and I'll start with number 4, self-deprecation. Self-deprecation is often used ironically, and almost always, here they are, loving and reverent. So they are used to make light of the situation at hand. An English friend of mine, she called me on the phone the other day, and she said that her hairdresser had died, and she was in tears. She was an emotional wreck. So I asked her, like, why, what's going on? And she said, well, the hairdresser is the only man in the world that knows how to handle the bundle of hay on my head. Going on to number 3, sarcasm. So after irony comes sarcasm. And obviously they can be confused. They're quite close together. Sarcasm tends to be a bit harsher. So, whereas irony is meant as a light form of mockery, often against oneself, the self-deprecation, sarcasm is mostly intended to insult the other one. The thing with sarcasm is it's really easy to detect because the speaker wants you to know you're being mocked. Where the beauty in irony is, it often goes undetected. Going on to number 5, and it does not become more British than this, it's puns. Puns are everywhere. British humour is steeped with puns. And if you look outside in a regular street, they're on shop fronts, a newspaper headline, advertisements, they're everywhere. And a good pun makes you chuckle. Thing is with puns, the British, the English, they kind of hate them at the same time as they love them. They just can't help but chuckle when they come across a really good one. It's probably one of the most hard forms of humor to understand as a non-English person because of a few reasons. The first reason is you have to be fluently in English. If you're not, you don't understand what the original word is, so you don't know what the play on the word is. And number 2, puns, they often seem a bit childish or far-fetched. But you have to understand it's a cultural thing, really. So, and the British, they've been using them, since forever, really. Here's some more, because I just can't get enough of good pun, really. And this slide I will use in my class. If I use this slide in my class, there's an assignment here for them. So, going on to number 6, and it's an important one. They're all important, yes, but this is so important, it's called wit. And wit, either you have or you don't. It's kind of a character thing. It might depend on your character, so even if you do have the best remark in the world, it all comes down to timing and delivery. And wit is being clever and funny, but the clever and funniness is a three-way of the remark, the timing and the delivery. So, Brits, they see humour in almost everything, in the most miserable of situations. And it's endearingly, but at the same time it also functions as a defense mechanism, to cope with the situation at hand. To make light of such situations, it works like medicine for them. But only when the joke is in good taste. Now, when is a joke in good taste? And that's the fun part of being British. There's always good taste in a joke, really. Here in Holland, you don't make fun at a funeral. British, they tend to do make fun at a funeral. So, going on to number 7, banter. And this one is an easy one. It's called banter. And, when you're amongst friends, at some point, you probably be the subject of banter. It's what friends do. Banter is verbally teasing somebody or some people. It's done in a light and friendly way. It's very important because bullying is often excused as banter. And they're not the same thing. Because banter only works when you're on the receiving end and you're okay with it. The Americans, they have something similar, but they call it the roast. To roast somebody. And when you roast somebody, in my honest opinion, that's more like bullying. It's to put down somebody. So it has to be done, and here they are again, loving and reverent. For instance, a friend of mine called me up the other day and he said, "Oh, Jeroen, I'm going for my first driving lesson." And I panicked. I said, "Wow, when, what time?" And he said, "Why? What do you want to know?" And he said, "Well, I have to keep my wife and children inside for safety." The last of the 8 themes that I want to run by you is called innuendo. Not just a very, very good song by a band called Queen, but it's innuendo, and it's the art of making remarks about matters that are a taboo, but you don't actually mention the taboo. You don't refer to them. often, or most of the time, they're sexually. And just as puns, innuendo can be found anywhere, and puns and innuendo often go good together. But innuendo is more subtle. So even on shows as, for instance, Great British Bake Off, you know, the English version of Heel Holland Bakt, the presenters use a lot of innuendo in their presenting. And so it goes to show that innuendo, it's for all the Brits, it's for young and old. Once again, it's all about timing and delivery. Because when a Brit comes with a remark full of innuendo, he'll do it with a deadpan face, and he'll read the situation at hand. So he'll make the remark, or she, and you understand the remark, but you can't reply to it because that would embarrass you. So I found this line on the internet, and I'm just going to run it by you. Yeah? Okay, here we go. British humour is often said to go over the heads of everyone else in the world, likely because it's far too sophisticated and pretentious for anybody to really understand. But, the British being British, all individually decided to pretend like they do understand, coming up with smart and sarcastic nonsense to keep the game up all these years. Well, that kind of sums up British humour, for me anyway. And I found the line on the internet, I couldn't tell you where. Anywho, British versus American humour. Getting to know the difference between British and American humour is a basis to getting to know the difference between the culture of the two countries. And if you're a fan of either one of them, it's hard not to be prejudiced against the other one. So let's try and take a look at the two from a neutral point of view, yeah? I found an interview, somebody interviewed Stephen Fry for American television, and a member of the audience asked him what he thought was the difference between American and British humour. So after a bit of explaining, he came up with an example, and he stated, well, you know, that show, Animal House, and there was a scene where a fellow playing folk music on a guitar, and John Belushi comes in and he picks up the guitar and he smashes it against the wall in 1,000 pieces, wiggling his eyebrows like so. Well, everyone thinks, oh God, he's so great. Well, the British comedian would want to play the folk singer. We would want to play the failure. There's a bit of an understanding for American humor. So, it's not that either one of them is funnier or better. There's great comedy written on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, but there are differences. As I said earlier, Brits like to make fun of themselves and do take themselves too serious. They don't. Whereas Americans, they tend to make fun of others. American humor is more optimistic. You know, the main character of the joke, he ends up on top with the girls, with the money, with the cup, I don't know. And often used comedic features would be slapstick or physical comedy. But in Britain, there is more use of self-deprecating humor, dry humor, that sort of stuff. So you have your pessimism versus optimism. You have dry humor versus slapstick, subtle jokes versus in-your-face comedy. But when comedy is written, we also see differences in the storylines. So if you compare sitcoms from both countries, we see that British sitcoms, they tend to end in disaster, you know, giving the audience room to fill in what would happen next. Where American sitcoms, they tend to end in a happy ending, or at least a closed ending. And it's also to be seen in the way people joke with one another. An American is more likely to make a joke about somebody else. The joke would be very recognizable as a joke, and most of the time only explainable in one way. But a Brit, he would make the joke about themselves, and the joke would often be explainable in more than one way, giving you room to think, and it's delivered with a seriousness that you might not even recognize it as a joke. So, this was it. And I hope you now have a bit of an understanding about British humour and how it works on the west side of the North Sea. I thank you for watching me. My name is Jeroen and you've all been marvellous.